In my last video, I talked about one of the most nostalgic memories I had of my childhood. Let me tell you, there was nothing quite like coming home from school and sitting at my grandmother's table. While most of her food was a hit, some wasn't. I remember good things like collard greens, smothered pork chops, fried chicken with red beans, and I remember things like crowder peas, lima beans, and succotash. But if your family was from the deep south like mine, a few things were constant at mealtime. Aside from something fried or smothered with gravy or stewed, you'd often also find a neat little piece of bread sitting just at the side of your plate. It was nice and golden brown, had a sweet taste with a bit of crispiness, and was usually either nice and moist with some crumb or straight up like pound cake. Either way, many of us know this little slice of heaven as cornbread. It accompanies almost any dish, it's nice to have, and it's quite tasty and easy to make. So, why don't we talk about that little delicious nugget of gold on the side of your plate, fresh cornbread. So what do you do when you have a bunch of dry corn and need to find a way to use it in some capacity? Well, dry corn doesn't have a whole lot of uses, right? We could maybe rehydrate it and use it like hominy or some other rehydrated corn. Oh, you can make popcorn too. Aside from that though, dry corn is great for grinding. It can be ground into a meal, cornmeal to be precise. Applying the dry kernels to a meal of some sort grinds it all down into a powder that can be used for a myriad of things. This method of making cornmeal comes from the Americas at large. Different groups of people raised and used corn or maize for all manners of culinary uses. From tortillas to polenta and grits, there is something for everyone, and given that you can make a bunch of cornmeal and store it for long-term use, you can see and understand why this product was so useful. Now, where does cornbread fit into this? Well, since corn itself was found all throughout the Americas, the native tribes would have been the ones to harness this product. In North America, Native Americans would have ground the corn up and mixed it with hot water for porridge or grits, or in our case, mixing water, fruits, beans, and other items and forming them into loaves or patties that can be cooked and eaten for a dense source of carbohydrates at any given time. Different tribes would process the cornmeal, more or less, and some would add certain beans or foraged items from their region to make their own tribal or family recipes. As the Americas began to become more populated, the settlers who were far more used to wheat had trouble not only cultivating corn, but turning it into something nutritious for them to eat. It is likely the healthy and nutrient-dense corn loaf would be passed around as an act of goodwill, allowing many to survive off the land. Settlers would use native tactics to turn corn into something of nutritional value. And given that corn needs to be processed with an alkali solution to actually gain nutrients from it, the kindness of the natives was a crucial part of their survival. Sadly, this kindness wasn't reciprocated later down the line, but the hold that corn has in the Americas and beyond was undeniable. The natives certainly did their thing and showed their mastery of their homelands. That is why it is very likely you see maize or corn in other parts of the world now. But back to cornbread. We could see that the natives offered their skills to the settlers, and Johnny cakes became a big part of the settler diet, and later down the line that got turned into something similar to the cornbread we now have in the South. One thing I've been neglecting, however, is what I said earlier. Many of us are used to the addition of honey or sugar to the taste of cornbread. In truth, historically, cornbread was only ever made with just a pinch of salt and maybe a bit of sugar for browning. Coarse cornmeal has natural sugar in it and aided the browning to get the loaf some Southerners are used to. However, I can imagine a lot of families like my own added sugar because it was a way to make cornbread more palatable. Let me explain. If you're American, or even if you aren't, you've more than likely been made aware of the transatlantic slave trade. This was a point in time where African men and women were forcibly traded from their homelands to be distributed around the world. While they were put into many parts of North America and other areas around it, the South was one particular place that my people were brought to. As a result, they worked on plantations and had to put together anything they could for food. Cornmeal happened to be a huge staple in the diet of the enslaved, along with things like pork of literally all persuasions. I promise you, all the pork, just all of it. I'm serious, every single piece. But one thing my people could do was use their rations to cook up something filling. Cornbread was initially a mash of water and cornmeal turned into a paste and cooked in the ashes of a fire. Given that this ash turned the corn alkali, it allowed the bodies of my ancestors the ability to process the corn properly, allowing for a more filling meal with each piece of bread eaten. As cornbread became more standardized, using hot lard to brown the bottom of the loaf became traditional, and eventually butter was also used. While sugar wasn't widely used either, it was possible that some African slaves would add molasses or honey to their cornbread. Sure, sugar wasn't normal in cornbread, but when you need to eat anything to survive, a bit of sugar makes the medicine go down. Sugarcane is a crop that they'd also harvest, so it's not out of the question either. This method would apparently also pop up in the north, which is why there's a divide in the country on what should be put in cornbread as a whole. Anyway, cornbread began to change as time went on, adding buttermilk, eggs, and other items until cornbread became a delicacy all over the states, from the East Coast to the West Coast. There are even vehement divides on what is or is not cornbread. It's not true cornbread if you add this or that or the third. If you want my personal take, I like a slightly sweetened cornbread myself, but savory cornbread is really good too. I know how my family makes it may not be traditional, but we like it. Whether you like your cornbread sweet or not, made with canned corn or creamed corn, cherish those recipes. They are something that links us back to our roots. Without the natives who forged a way for this important staple in the southern cuisine, we wouldn't have this dish in the first place. Whether you add sugar or not, cornbread helped build everyone it came across. With a dense form of nutrients in such a nice little package, no wonder people have such fond memories of a little loaf of bread that is cornbread. And now, of course, I'm going to have to break some hearts and make cornbread the way I like it. While I was going to contact NoodleDog, I saw a recipe online that I wanted to try by J. Kenji Lopez Alt. The link will be down below, but we'll go through things together. The most important part about cornbread is cornmeal. We'll need it finely ground for this recipe. And you'll also need a good pan. Cast iron is the gold standard, but surprise, I don't have a cast iron pan. I'll be using a baking pan to compensate, though if you want me to get a cast iron, you should subscribe to support me. Maybe I'll buy one if we get to 500 subscribers. We'll see. We'll also need buttermilk, flour, butter, sugar, salt, baking soda and powder, eggs, and surprisingly, sour cream. This is what made me want to try this recipe the most. The acidity of the buttermilk and sour cream will make this extremely tender and moist, so with that, let's follow the recipe, shall we? To start, we'll take 7 tablespoons of unsalted butter and drop it into our vessel of choice. I'm using this baking tin I have, of course, but if you have a cast iron, the recipe calls for that. Next, we'll preheat our oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit or around 218 degrees Celsius, placing an oven rack in the middle of the oven. We'll place our pan in the oven to come to temp for around 10 to 20 minutes, and from here, we'll work on our dry ingredients. Start by adding 1 cup of cornmeal to a bowl, followed by 1 cup of flour. Next, we'll add 4 tablespoons of sugar, 1 teaspoon of kosher salt, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, and a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. Give this all a quick whisk to combine before moving to our wet ingredients. In a separate bowl, I'll begin by adding 2 eggs to the second bowl, followed by 4 ounces or half a cup of buttermilk and 6 ounces or 3/4 of a cup of sour cream. Give all of this a whisk and be sure to check on your pan every few minutes to make sure the butter doesn't burn. Once the butter is melted and all the solids, these little white bits here, begin to turn golden, pull the pan out of the oven and pour all but about 1 tablespoon into a separate heat-proof vessel. With all of this done, we'll begin mixing. Go ahead and slowly stream your browned butter into the wet mixture, whisking to combine. Once that's done, go ahead and mix the egg mixture into your dry ingredients, whisking until it all comes together. With the batter done, let's go ahead and check our pan real quick. If it's too cool, place it back into the oven for a minute or so until the pan is hot enough to get the butter nice and sizzling. At this point, take out the pan and swirl the butter around just a bit to coat the bottom. We'll pour, or push, our batter into the pan, and after a quick shimmy, we'll toss it to the oven for around 20 to 25 minutes. After 20 minutes or so, take a toothpick and insert it into the thickest part of the cornbread. If the toothpick comes out clean, or mostly clean, take it out and let Mr. Cornbread rest for 10 minutes or so. I know it looks good, but it seriously has to wait, like all breads do. But wait, Noodle, I hear you say, I'm scared I'll burn my butter in the oven. Can I make brown butter outside of my oven? The answer is yes. Let me show you something. Brown butter is a fantastic way to bolster the flavor of baked goods, confections, and even your regular food that requires butter. It's not useful in every scenario, but its toasted and nutty flavor does lend really well to baked goods and a couple other things specifically. In order to make brown butter, we'll take our butter, let's say an entire stick, and toss it into a saucepan. Turn the heat to low and let the butter melt. From here, we're just going to keep an eye on the butter. If it helps, turn the heat up to medium-low and watch the butter begin to cook. What we're looking for is for the milk solids to begin to brown. You'll notice these little white specks in the butter begin to sizzle, and eventually they'll get all nice and toasty like a piece of toast. These will sink to the bottom of the saucepan, so keep the butter moving to keep an eye on these little bits. You'll know you've gotten close when the butter begins to smell less like butter and more like toasted nuts. When you smell this, the butter solids should be nice and golden. You'll want to immediately take it off the heat and put it into a heat-proof vessel to cool. And with that, you've just made brown butter. It stores in the fridge for a week or two if you put it in a container. For this recipe, you'll just put your made brown butter into a pan, melt it, and then add it to your cornbread tin and your batter. If you have time and want to boost your dishes, try working brown butter in sauces, pastas, meats, and breakfast items. In fact, this would go really well on some cookies, but we'll talk about that when you're older. Anyway, with this done, our cornbread should be rested enough to get a slice off. All we need to do is add a small pat of butter right on top and perhaps a tiny drizzle of honey before admiring this golden piece of heaven. In tasting, this was moist, tender, a little sweet, and nutty thanks to the brown butter. This is wonderfully simple and delicious in its conception. Sure, it's northern cornbread, but I wouldn't complain about this whatsoever if it showed up at my doorstep. Now, since I've got some cornmeal left, how about we make a little bonus? This recipe is from Chef Mike Hard here on YouTube, and it seems pretty easy enough. We'll begin by filling a small saucepan with a cup of water and setting it on the stove to boil. Next, we'll mix the dry ingredients, adding a cup and a half of fine cornmeal to a bowl, followed by half a cup of all-purpose flour, a teaspoon of both baking powder and salt, and a tablespoon of sugar. Give this all a quick whisk, and once the water is boiling hot, add a small amount of hot water to the dry ingredients. You're looking to make a dough with this, so add hot water in increments until the mixture begins to come together, sticking to itself without being too loose. We'll set this aside and prepare a pan or skillet with oil. I've chosen vegetable oil. When the oil is nice and hot, take a small handful of the cornmeal dough and roll it into a ball with your hands. Then flatten it out until it's nice and even before gently laying the puff of corn into the frying oil. Do this until you run out of dough, and once you're done, fry this all for around 3 minutes or so before flipping the cornbread and cooking it on the other side until a golden brown color is achieved. Once it's done, drain it all on a wire rack or paper towel lined plate, and after a few moments, they're ready to eat. Unlike our other cornbread, it's a lot more corn forward. It's crispy, slightly sweet, but toasty and hearty too. Adding a bit of honey here took it over the edge for me, and I recommend watching Chef Mike's recipe, which I'll put in the link down below for you. And there we go. 2 recipes and 1 technique just for you, because I like you a lot. These take me right back to my childhood, and I think you'll really enjoy these. Both recipes can be put on a table in under an hour and can be used to sop up any beans, stews, or soups you put it into, or they can be a great snack by themselves. With all this baking around here, I need to find a way to use this brown butter, but that'll come next time. Cornbread is super easy to make, and if you have some cornmeal, you likely have everything else to make some for this treat. If you're into baking, then give this one a try. Serve it with red beans or collard greens or whatever you want. It's fresh bread and can last you a few days if it's stored right. That is, if you don't eat it all right away. This stuff fed many people before us, and it's not going away anytime soon. With that though, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. If you like this video, consider giving it a like. I think I earned it, don't you? If you know someone who might like these recipes, share it with them, and anyone else who just likes food in general. Also, don't forget to subscribe. The kitchen will stay open as long as you guys keep coming back. So be sure to eat well out there, and until next time, I'll see you dogs later. On the subject of eating, literally every piece of pork, the entire pig, chitlins. Chitlins, that's all I'm going to say.